Imagine walking through a city with no sound except your own footsteps. No car horns in the distance, no conversations drifting from windows, no construction noise, no music from passing cars, no sirens cutting through the afternoon. Instead, you stand in an empty plaza where thousands once gathered. The sun filters through broken columns, casting long shadows across weathered stone. A warm wind moves through empty doorways, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and dust. Somewhere in the ruins, a bird calls out, the sound echoing off walls that haven't heard human voices in centuries. This is the sound of a lost city. This is silence with memory. It's the year 300 BCE, or perhaps 1200 BCE, or maybe 500 CE. The exact date doesn't matter because we're not here for the dramatic moment of collapse. We're here for something quieter. We're here for the ordinary days, the slow accumulation of life that once filled these streets, and the even slower process of forgetting that followed. Imagine a city at its peak, not the moment of conquest or destruction, but a Tuesday afternoon when nothing particularly important happened. When merchants arranged their goods in the marketplace, when children played in the shade of temples, when someone swept their doorstep and someone else carried water from the fountain, when the city breathed with the rhythm of 10,000 small routines. These are the moments that don't make it into history books. There's no battle to record, no treaty to sign, no dramatic proclamation. Just life continuing as it always had, as everyone assumed it always would. But here's what archaeology has taught us. These quiet days, these ordinary moments, they're actually the majority of what happened in any ancient city. The dramatic events, the conquests and fires and earthquakes, those were exceptions. Most of the time, cities simply existed. People woke up, went about their business, returned home, slept, and did it all again the next day. Century after century of Tuesdays. What we call lost cities aren't really lost. They're just quiet now. Their stones remain, half buried or fully exposed. Their streets still run in the same directions. The places where people gathered are still there, just empty. And if you know how to look, if you can read the archaeological record like a language, these cities are still telling their stories. They're just whispering. Let me take you to one of these whispers. We'll start in a place you might have heard of, though probably not its ancient name. The Greeks called it Mycenae, Mycenae, a citadel in the northeastern Peloponnese, built on a rocky hill between two mountains. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I create these journeys. You can subscribe if you'd like, and maybe leave a comment about where you are right now. Someone in Sydney at sunset, someone in Berlin at midnight, someone in Buenos Aires at dawn, all drifting toward rest while we walk together through these silent streets of memory. Mycenae in its prime, around 1300 BCE, was nothing like the ruins that tourists photograph today. It was a thriving citadel, a palace complex surrounded by massive walls so impressive that later Greeks believed they must have been built by Cyclops, the mythical one-eyed giants. No humans, they thought, could have moved stones that large, but humans did. Humans stacked those enormous limestone blocks without mortar, fitting them together with such precision that many still stand after more than 3,000 years. The palace sat at the highest point, its rooms arranged around courtyards, its walls decorated with frescoes showing processions and hunts and women in elaborate dresses. Below the palace, the town spread down the hillside, stone houses with flat roofs, narrow streets winding between them, workshops where artisans shaped bronze and carved ivory and painted pottery. A typical morning in Mycenae started early, not because of alarm clocks, obviously, but because summer in Greece means the sun rises before 6 a.m. and the heat builds quickly. Better to work in the cool morning hours and rest during the afternoon when the light becomes white and heavy. The first sounds would have been animals, goats being led out to pasture, their bells clanking softly, chickens scratching in courtyards, dogs stretching and shaking off sleep. Then human sounds would join in, doors opening, voices greeting neighbours, children being called to help with morning tasks. Down in the lower town, the potter would already be at his wheel. Clay needs to be worked while it's still damp and pliable, so he rises before dawn to wedge it, removing air bubbles, preparing it for the day's work. His hands know the motion without thinking. Press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn. A rhythm as natural as breathing. By the time the sun clears the eastern mountains, his wheel is spinning and the first vessel of the day is taking shape under his palms. In the palace above, the day begins differently, but with the same essential rhythm. Servants draw water from the cistern, careful not to waste a drop. Water in Mycenae is precious. The citadel has no natural spring, so every gallon must be collected from runoff during winter rains or carried up from the valley below. The palace has an ingenious system of channels and storage tanks, but still, water is measured, conserved, respected. A scribe arrives at the administrative room carrying his tools, clay tablets, a stylus, a basket of older records that need to be consulted. He sits on a low stool, sets out his materials, and begins the day's work, recording shipments of grain, tallying sheep and cattle, noting the distribution of bronze to weapon makers. Linear B script flows from his stylus. Not an alphabet, but a syllabary, where each symbol represents a whole syllable. We know this now because scholars deciphered Linear B in the 1950s. These tablets aren't literature. They're not myths or poetry. They're inventory lists, receipts, tax records, the most mundane bureaucratic documents imaginable, and yet they tell us so much. They tell us that Mycenae had an organized economy, centralized record keeping, specialized craftsmen, trade networks stretching across the Mediterranean. They tell us the names of months and occupations and types of offerings made to specific gods. They preserve words that people spoke 3,000 years ago, ordinary words like barley and wheel and shepherd. The scribe doesn't know he's creating historical records. He's just doing his job, tracking resources, maintaining order. He expects these tablets to be used for a season, maybe a year, then recycled when the information is no longer relevant. He certainly doesn't imagine that archaeologists in the 20th century CE will treasure these mundane lists, study them obsessively, debate the meaning of every word. Outside the palace walls, in the lower town, life follows its own rhythms. A woman sweeps her threshold using a broom of bound twigs. Dust rises in the slanted morning light. She's thinking about the upcoming festival, mentally planning her family's contribution to the feast. They'll need to provide a portion of grain and some wine. Perhaps her husband can contribute labor, helping to prepare the ceremonial space. Her daughter comes to the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The woman sends her to fetch water, handing her a clay jug decorated with painted spirals. The girl, perhaps 10 years old, walks down the sloping street toward the fountain house. Other girls and women are already there, filling their vessels, exchanging news. This is where gossip travels, where information flows, where the unofficial business of the city gets conducted. The fountain house is built of stone, with a channeled spout that flows continuously during rainy season, less reliably in summer. The water comes from springs further up the mountain, directed through carefully engineered terracotta pipes. When the pipes break, which they sometimes do, skilled workers must trace the problem through the system and make repairs. Nothing in an ancient city runs automatically. Everything requires constant maintenance, constant attention. The girl fills her jug, hoists it onto her shoulder, and begins the walk back up the hill. The weight is familiar. She's been doing this since she was 7. First with smaller vessels, now with full-sized ones. Her muscles have adapted. Her gait has adjusted. This is just part of being a girl in Mycenae, like learning to spin wool or help prepare food or eventually manage her own household. As morning progresses toward midday, the city grows warmer and louder. In the marketplace, merchants spread their goods on woven mats. Textiles from the palace workshops, wool dyed deep red with kermes, a colour so prized it gives Mycenae part of its wealth. Pottery from local workshops and imported pieces from Cyprus and Egypt. Bronze tools, newly forged knives and pins and needles. Foodstuffs, grain and olive oil and dried fish and fresh vegetables brought in from the surrounding countryside. Trade isn't done with coins. Coins won't be invented for another several centuries. Instead, people barter or use commodity money. A standard measure of grain might be exchanged for a specific weight of bronze. Palace tablets record these transactions in obsessive detail, but most everyday exchanges happen informally, negotiated between buyer and seller based on need and relationship and how much they trust each other. By noon, the real heat has arrived. People retreat indoors or into shade. Work continues, but at a slower pace. This is a good time for indoor tasks: grinding grain, spinning wool, repairing tools, preparing food. The afternoon meal is usually simple: bread, olives, cheese perhaps, water or watered wine. The main meal will come in the evening after the heat breaks. In the palace, the afternoon brings meetings, officials discussing the upcoming harvest, estimating yields, planning storage, military commanders reviewing the garrison, considering the state of weapons and armor, discussing rumors of unrest in the territories, religious officials preparing for festivals, ensuring the proper animals are available for sacrifice, that the necessary supplies of oil and grain are set aside for offerings. These meetings are conducted in the Megaron, the Great Hall, a rectangular room with a central hearth, 4 columns supporting the roof, walls painted with frescoes showing hunts and processions. The throne sits against one wall, though the king himself isn't always present at these administrative sessions. Governance in Mycenaean Greece involves layers of bureaucracy, priests and scribes and regional officials all maintaining the complex machinery of palace economy. As afternoon fades toward evening, the city begins to stir again. The heat loosens its grip. Shadows grow longer, softer. People emerge from houses, resuming outdoor work. The potter returns to his wheel for a few more hours. The metalworker lights his furnace, preparing to cast bronze while the temperature is more bearable. In houses throughout the lower town, women prepare the evening meal: lentils stewed with onions and herbs, flatbread baking on hot stones. If it's a prosperous household, there might be meat, though that's special, reserved for festivals or important occasions. Most days, protein comes from cheese and legumes. The meal is ready as the sun approaches the western horizon. Families gather, sitting on low stools or on the floor. Food is served from common vessels. There are no individual plates, no separate portions. Everyone reaches into the shared dishes, using bread as a scoop, drinking from a passed cup. Conversation flows easily. The day's events, plans for tomorrow, stories everyone's heard before but enjoys hearing again. A joke about the neighbor's goat that got loose, a comment about the quality of this year's olive harvest, a question about whether the fishing boats will go out tomorrow if the wind stays calm. Children are part of these gatherings, though they learn to listen more than speak. They absorb the rhythms of adult conversation, the way information passes, the subtle markers of status and relationship embedded in who speaks when and how others respond. This is education in Mycenaean Greece. Not formal schooling for most children, but apprenticeship in being human, watching, listening, imitating, gradually taking on more responsibility. After the meal, as darkness settles, the pace slows even further. Oil lamps are lit, small clay vessels filled with olive oil, a wick floating in the center. The light they provide is dim, warm, flickering. Enough to see by, not enough to work by in any detailed way. So evening becomes a time for talking, for music, for quiet tasks that don't require precision. Some people might continue simple work, carding wool, shelling nuts, mending by feel rather than sight. But mostly, evening is for gathering, not just nuclear families, but extended groups. Neighbors drift over, conversations blend together, children play quietly in corners. Someone might tell a story or sing. These are the moments when oral culture transmits itself, when myths are repeated, when histories are remembered, when the shared knowledge of the community passes from one generation to the next. The stories they tell, we can only guess at. Some became the myths written down centuries later by Homer and Hesiod, the tale of the Trojan War, the labours of Heracles, the journey of Jason and the Argonauts. But there must have been countless other stories that never made it into the permanent record. Local tales, family histories, amusing anecdotes about ancestors, cautionary stories about what happens when you offend the gods or ignore proper ritual. All of it delivered orally, memorized, varied slightly with each telling, gradually evolving over generations. By the time full darkness has fallen, most people are ready for sleep. There are no books to read, no screens to scroll, no artificial light bright enough to fool the brain into thinking it's still day. When the sun goes down, the body naturally prepares for rest. People lie down on sleeping platforms, covered with woven blankets or animal skins depending on wealth and season. Extended families often sleep in the same room, bodies close together, the sound of breathing and small movements creating a gentle background noise. A dog might settle near the door, a baby might fuss briefly, then quiet. Outside, the citadel settles into its own rhythm. Guards walk the walls, their footsteps soft but regular. An owl calls from the hillside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, is answered by another, then silence returns. This was a day in Mycenae. One day among thousands. Nothing remarkable happened. No invasion, no earthquake, no dramatic event worth recording. Just the steady tick of ordinary life. The potter making vessels, the scribe recording inventories, the girl carrying water, the family sharing a meal. Multiply this day by all the people in the city, then multiply it again by all the years the city stood, and you begin to glimpse the enormous weight of accumulated normalcy that made up Mycenaean civilization. But of course, it didn't last. It never does. Around 1200 BCE, something happened. We're not entirely sure what. The archaeological record shows widespread destruction across the Mediterranean. Mycenae burned, so did other palace centres. Whether it was invasion, internal revolt, climate change, economic collapse, or some combination, we can't say for certain. What we do know is that the palace society didn't survive. The scribes stopped writing Linear B. The administrative system collapsed. The trade networks fractured. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of reduced population and simpler material culture that lasted for centuries. But here's what's interesting for our purposes. The collapse wasn't instant. Mycenae didn't empty overnight. After the palace burned, people continued to live in the ruins for a while. The lower town persisted. Households carried on, using broken pieces of the palace complex for their own purposes. Stones were repurposed for new construction. Rooms that once served administrative functions became simple dwellings. The Great Megaron, the throne room, gradually filled with debris and was built over. This is the part that fascinates me most. Not the dramatic moment of destruction, but the slow fade that followed. The gradual process of a city becoming a ruin, becoming a memory, becoming a myth. Over decades and centuries, fewer people lived in Mycenae. The sophisticated systems broke down. Literacy was lost in this region. Linear B forgotten. The palace economy that had organized so much of life simply stopped functioning. People reverted to simpler ways of living, smaller communities, more localized economies, oral rather than written record keeping. And all the while, the ruins remained. Stones that had once been walls stood exposed to weather. Rain seeped between blocks. Frost expanded in cracks. Vegetation took root. First grasses, then shrubs, eventually trees. The slow, patient work of nature reclaiming what humans had built. People still knew about Mycenae. They could see the massive walls, but the memory of who built them and why grew hazy. By the time of classical Greece, 1,000 years after the citadel's peak, Mycenae was already ancient. Greeks of the 5th century BCE looked at the ruins the same way we might look at Roman ruins today, with a sense of awe, with curiosity about the past, with stories that might or might not be true. They called the walls Cyclopean, built by giants, because surely no normal humans could have managed such construction. They associated the site with myths, with Agamemnon and the Trojan War, though the real history was far more complex. Gradually, even those diminished memories faded. During the Middle Ages, Mycenae was just a pile of old stones on a hillside. Local shepherds grazed their flocks near the ruins. Some stones were taken for building material in nearby villages. The site was there, obvious, but no longer meaningful in any active sense. It was only in the 19th century CE, when archaeology became a scientific discipline, that Mycenae started to speak again. Heinrich Schliemann, though controversial in his methods, conducted excavations that revealed the wealth and sophistication of the Bronze Age civilization. The famous golden death mask, the shaft graves, the carefully worked artifacts. Evidence of a culture that had been forgotten for millennia. Today, Mycenae is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists walk the paths that ancient merchants once walked. They stand in the same great hall where kings once sat. They photograph the Lion Gate, massive blocks of stone topped with a relief sculpture of 2 lions flanking a column. And if they're quiet, if they visit early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the tour buses have left, they can almost hear it. Not the noise of the living city, but the silence of absence. The wind through empty rooms, the cry of birds nesting in walls, the weight of all those accumulated days, those thousands of ordinary Tuesdays, present in the stones but invisible to the eye. Let's move to another city now, somewhere very different geographically, but similar in its arc from glory to silence. Petra, the rose-red city, carved into sandstone cliffs in what is now southern Jordan. Petra was the capital of the Nabataean kingdom, a a trading empire that flourished from roughly the 4th century BCE to the 1st century CE. The Nabataeans were Arab people who controlled crucial trade routes, the paths that brought frankincense and myrrh from Arabia, spices from India, silk from China, all flowing toward Mediterranean markets. They grew wealthy from this trade, and they poured that wealth into their city. But Petra wasn't built on an open plain. It was hidden, protected, accessible only through a narrow gorge called the Sick. Imagine approaching Petra for the first time. You're a merchant, perhaps from Damascus or Alexandria. Your camels are loaded with goods. You've been traveling for weeks through desert and rocky highlands. Your guide leads you to what looks like an insignificant crack in the cliffs. You enter the Siq, a winding passage between towering rock walls. In places, the walls rise 80 meters above you, so close they almost touch overhead. The path is narrow, dim, cool. Sunlight filters down in slanted beams. Water channels, carved into the rock walls, carry precious water from springs to the city. The walk through the Siq takes perhaps 20 minutes, long enough to build anticipation, to leave behind the open desert, to feel like you're entering somewhere special, somewhere protected. Then the passage opens, and there, directly ahead, carved into the rose-colored sandstone cliff, is the treasury. Al-Khazna in Arabic. Not actually a treasury, but a royal tomb, though you wouldn't know it from the facade. 6 columns, classical Hellenistic style, supporting an elaborate upper story with carved pediments and reliefs. The entire thing hewn from the living rock, not built but revealed, subtracted from the cliff face with chisels and patience. The scale is overwhelming. The facade stands nearly 40 meters tall. The craftsmanship is exquisite. Columns are perfectly proportional. Details are crisp despite 2,000 years of weathering. It's designed to impress, to demonstrate wealth and power and technical sophistication. And it works. Even today, even knowing what to expect, visitors to Petra emerge from the Siq and stop, stunned by that first view of the treasury. In its heyday, Petra was much more than the treasury. As you pass beyond that initial facade, the valley opens up. Hundreds of tombs carved into cliffs on all sides. A Roman-style theatre carved directly from the rock, seating for thousands. Temples, both traditional Nabataean and later Roman designs. A colonnaded street, shops and administrative buildings lining a processional way. Residential areas, though many houses were built rather than carved, so they've since disappeared, leaving only foundations. The daily life of Petra revolved around water and trade. Water first, because Petra sits in an arid region. Annual rainfall is minimal. Without sophisticated water management, the city couldn't exist. The Nabataeans became masters of hydraulic engineering. They carved channels and pipes throughout the rock. They built dams to catch flash floods during rare rainstorms. They constructed cisterns, underground chambers lined with waterproof plaster, storing water through dry months. Every drop was directed, stored, conserved. A morning in Petra began with water management. Slaves and servants would check the system, clearing any blockages, ensuring flow from springs to cisterns to distribution points. The sound of running water in a desert city must have been both practical and symbolic, a constant reminder of Nabataean engineering skill, of the city's ability to thrive in an impossible environment. Meanwhile, in the caravanserais, merchants would be preparing for the day's business. A caravanserai is essentially a combination inn and warehouse. Traveling merchants could stable their camels, secure their goods, sleep safely, and conduct trade. Petra had several places where goods from across the known world accumulated before being dispersed to new markets. Imagine being a spice merchant. You arrived 3 days ago with a caravan from southern Arabia. You're carrying frankincense, the aromatic resin tapped from boswellia trees. It's valuable, desired for religious ceremonies throughout the Mediterranean and Near East. Romans burn it in their temples. Egyptians use it in embalming. Everyone wants it, and you've traveled dangerous roads to bring it here. Now you're negotiating with middlemen, traders who will take your frankincense westward toward Gaza and the Mediterranean ports. You speak in Aramaic, the lingua franca of trade, though you hear Greek and Latin and various Arabian dialects around you. You measure your goods carefully. Quality varies, and you need to prove your frankincense is pure, properly cured, worth the price you're asking. The negotiations might take days. There's no hurry. You'll stay in Petra, resting, enjoying the city, letting your camels recover before the next leg of your journey. You might visit the temples, making offerings to Dushara, the chief Nabataean god. You might bathe in one of the public baths, relaxing muscles sore from weeks of travel. You'll certainly eat well. Petra, despite its desert location, has access to varied food. Dates and grain from irrigated oases, meat from sheep and goats raised in surrounding highlands, vegetables grown in terraced gardens wherever water can be directed, imported luxuries like wine and olive oil, flowing in along the same trade routes that carry frankincense out. The afternoon in Petra would be hot. Desert heat building in the narrow valley, radiating off red stone. Most people would retreat indoors or into shade. The rock-carved tombs, when used as living spaces, stay relatively cool. The stone insulates, maintaining a more stable temperature than structures built of lighter materials. This is prime time for administrative work. Scribes working on contracts and inventories, officials reviewing tax records, calculating the city's share of trade revenues. Nabataean scribes wrote in Aramaic, though they developed their own script that would eventually evolve into the Arabic alphabet. Their documents were probably written on parchment or papyrus, materials that don't survive well in most conditions. We have few Nabataean texts. So much of what we know about their culture comes from archaeology and from descriptions by Greek and Roman writers. As evening approached, the city would come alive again. The heat would break. Shadows would lengthen across the valley. Merchants and residents would emerge, resuming business and social activities. The colonnaded street would fill with people, conversations in multiple languages, the smell of cooking fires, roasting meat, baking bread, music perhaps, though we can only guess at what Nabataean music sounded like. They had contact with Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Persian cultures, so likely their musical traditions blended influences from all those sources. Meals in Petra would be social occasions. Extended family groups, business associates, travelers sharing food and stories. A merchant from Petra might host a colleague from Palmyra, exchanging news about trade routes and political situations. Are the desert roads safe? Have any new taxes been imposed? What goods are in demand this season? Children would be present, learning through observation. A son might be apprenticed to his father's trade, gradually taking on more responsibility in negotiations and caravan organization. A daughter might learn household management, including the critical skills of water conservation and food storage in an arid environment. As darkness fell, the temperature would drop significantly. Desert nights can be cold. Families would gather around fires or braziers, the flames casting dancing shadows on rock walls. Conversations would continue, Softer now, more intimate. Stories would be told. Maybe tales of the gods, Dushara and Al-Uzza. Maybe family histories, remembering ancestors who had built this trade empire from desert routes. Maybe ghost stories about the tombs surrounding the city, about the spirits of dead kings who still watched over Petra. Eventually sleep. Bodies wrapped in blankets, lying on cushions or simple beds. The city quiet except for night guards and perhaps the distant call of desert animals. Above, the same stars that guided caravans across trackless sands. The same moon measuring out months and years. But Petra's glory didn't last either. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire annexed the Nabataean kingdom. Petra became a provincial city. Trade routes shifted. New roads bypassed the city, heading directly to Mediterranean ports without the detour through the desert valley. The economic foundation that had supported Petra's wealth gradually eroded. The city didn't empty immediately. It persisted for centuries, first as a Roman and then Byzantine provincial town. Christian churches were built. Some of the tombs were converted to Christian use. Life continued, but on a reduced scale. The great days of caravan trade were over. Then came a devastating earthquake in 363 CE. Buildings collapsed. Water systems broke. The damage was severe enough that the city never fully recovered. People continued to live in Petra, but in smaller numbers. By the 7th century CE, when Islamic armies swept through the region, Petra was already a shadow of its former self. Over subsequent centuries, it faded further. The remaining population eventually abandoned the site. Local Bedouin tribes knew about the ruins, sometimes using them for shelter, but the city's history was forgotten. Petra became legend. Medieval European texts mentioned it vaguely, a lost city somewhere in the desert. But no one from the Western world had seen it for 1,000 years. Until 1812, when a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as a Muslim pilgrim, convinced a local guide to take him to the ruins. Burckhardt's account reintroduced Petra to the Western world. Archaeologists and adventurers followed. Excavations began. The process of rediscovering Petra's past started. And here's the remarkable thing. Despite centuries of abandonment, despite earthquakes and flash floods and the patient erosion of wind and sand, Petra's carved facades remained. Stone is patient. Stone remembers. When you visit Petra today, you walk the same route ancient merchants walked. You pass through the sick and emerge to see the treasury exactly as they saw it, give or take some weather damage. You can stand in the theatre where Nabataeans once gathered. You can touch the water channels they carved. The city is silent now. No merchants calling their wares, no camels complaining, no children playing in the streets. Just wind through empty tombs. Just the occasional bleating of goats, descendants of the herds that ancient Nabataeans kept. Just tourists moving through with cameras, trying to capture something of the magic that still clings to these rose-red walls. Mycenae and Petra, two cities from different times and places, yet their stories arc the same way. Rise, flourish, fade, silence. And in that silence, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of all those ordinary days. The potter's wheel spinning, the scribe's stylus scratching, the merchant negotiating, the child carrying water, the family sharing a meal. All of it gone, and yet somehow still present, held in the patient memory of stone. Let me take you to one more place, somewhere less famous but equally haunting. Uruk, in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. One of the world's first true cities, a place where urban civilization was invented. If you could stand in Uruk around 3000 BCE, you'd be witnessing something completely new in human history. For the first time, tens of thousands of people living in close proximity. Not a village, not a town, but a genuine city. Walls enclosing 6 square kilometers, monumental architecture, massive temple complexes built of mud brick. The earliest known example of true writing, cuneiform script scratched into clay tablets. The invention of the wheel, the development of complex bureaucracy, all of it happening here, in this city on the Euphrates River. Imagine a summer evening in Uruk, the sun sinking toward the western horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and red. The heat of the day finally breaking. All across the city, people emerging from houses, heading to the river to bathe, to fetch water, to cool off in the evening breeze. The Euphrates is the lifeline. Everything depends on it. The irrigation channels that water the fields, the drinking water for the city, the transportation route that connects Uruk to other cities upstream and down. Even the mud bricks that make up most of the city's structures come from river clay mixed with straw and dried in the sun. Near the river, children splash and play under the watchful eyes of adults. Further up the bank, women wash clothes, pounding fabric against stones, rinsing in the current. Men fill leather bags with water to carry back to their households. Everyone moves with the easy competence of people who have done these tasks every day of their lives. The temple complex dominates the city's skyline. A ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid of mud brick, topped with a shrine to Inanna, goddess of love and war. The ziggurat rises approximately 13 meters, enormous for the time, visible from anywhere in the city and from farmland beyond the walls. As evening settles, priests would be preparing for nightly rituals, lighting oil lamps throughout the temple, preparing offerings of bread and beer for the goddess, chanting hymns in Sumerian, the language of sacred texts. Inside the temple complex, there are also administrative offices. Uruk runs on bureaucracy. Scribes track everything, rations distributed to workers, tributes brought in from villages, animals sacrificed in ceremonies, grain stored in massive communal granaries. Every transaction documented in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. These are the earliest examples of writing we have, and they're not poetry. They're economic records, evidence of a complex society that needed to track obligations and resources across thousands of people. Down in the residential quarters, houses are built wall to wall, creating narrow, winding streets. Most houses have an internal courtyard for privacy, for light and air, for household activities. This is where the real life of the city happens. A family preparing dinner, bread baking in a clay oven, a stew of lentils and vegetables simmering in a pot, maybe fish from the river if someone had a good day. Mostly though, the diet is grain-based. Barley is the staple. It's made into bread, porridge, and beer. Yes, beer. The Sumerians loved beer. They had multiple varieties. The brewing process was considered sacred, overseen by the goddess Ninkasi. Workers were often paid partially in beer rations. It was safer to drink than water, more nutritious than bread alone, and provided a welcome respite from the labor of daily life. As full darkness arrives, the city doesn't go silent. It can't. Too many people living too close together. There's always noise, babies crying, dogs barking, voices drifting from courtyards, sometimes music, the sound of a lyre or a drum, someone singing. The streets are dark, no streetlights, no illumination beyond what spills from individual houses. Most people stay home after dark, It's not safe or practical to move around the city without light. But within homes, life continues. Oil lamps provide enough light for simple tasks and conversation. This is the time for stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though not yet written in the form we know, is being told orally. The tale of a king of Uruk who seeks immortality and learns to accept his mortality. It's their story, local, about their city, and yet it touches on universal human concerns. What does it mean to be mortal? How should we live knowing we'll die? What legacy can we leave behind? Children listen, absorbing the rhythm and language of epic poetry. They'll tell these same stories to their own children someday, keeping the oral tradition alive even after it's also been written down. Because writing doesn't replace oral culture in ancient Uruk, it supplements it. Most people can't read. Literacy is a specialized skill, learned by scribes through years of training. For everyone else, knowledge still passes through speech, through memory, through the living voice. Eventually, sleep comes to Uruk. Families lie down on reed mats or simple beds. The house doors are closed, though they probably don't lock. There's a sense of security in being surrounded by walls, by neighbors, by the collective presence of thousands of people. Very different from the vulnerability of small, isolated villages. Above the sleeping city, the same stars wheel across the sky. The same stars the Sumerians were beginning to map and name. Astronomy and astrology developing hand in hand, watching celestial patterns, trying to understand divine will written in the movements of planets. Uruk flourished for thousands of years. Think about that. Thousands of years. It's almost incomprehensible. The city that existed in 3000 BCE was still inhabited in 200 BCE, though much changed. That's longer than the entire span of Western civilization, from ancient Greece to now. But eventually, like all cities, Uruk faded. The final blow came with changing river courses. The Euphrates shifted, moving away from the city. Without reliable water, the irrigation systems failed. Fields became desert. The population dispersed. By early Islamic times, Uruk was abandoned. The mud brick buildings, exposed to rain and wind, began to erode. Mud brick doesn't last like stone. It melts back into the earth it came from. Over centuries, the great city became a series of mounds, tells, hills of accumulated debris marking where buildings once stood. The ziggurat collapsed. The walls crumbled. Local people mined the site for bricks to use in their own construction. The location of Uruk was forgotten. The name survived in texts, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in Sumerian king lists, but nobody knew where the actual city had been. Until archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began excavating these tells in southern Iraq, piecing together the story of this first great experiment in urban living. What they found astonished them. Not just buildings and pottery, but thousands of clay tablets. The written record of daily life, contracts and receipts and letters and myths and medical texts and mathematical calculations. The voices of people who lived 5,000 years ago, preserved in clay, telling us what they ate and what they traded and what they worried about and what stories they told themselves about gods and heroes. Today, Uruk is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also in a region that's seen immense conflict. Archaeological work has been interrupted by wars. Some parts of the site have been damaged by military activity and looting. It's a reminder that these silent cities aren't just relics. They're still caught up in human affairs, still vulnerable to the same forces, conflict and neglect and changing priorities that led to their original abandonment. But the site remains. The tells are still there, still holding their stories. When conditions allow, archaeologists return, carefully excavating, documenting, trying to understand more about how this first city worked, how people lived when urban civilization was brand new. But before we rest completely, let me take you to a few more quiet corners. Places that don't appear on most tourist maps. Cities that slumbered so deeply that even their names have been half forgotten. These are the truly silent ones, the cities that whisper rather than speak. Consider Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, located in central Anatolia in modern Turkey. If you visit today, you'll find an enormous site sprawling across rocky hills. Massive walls still standing in places, gates with carved lions and sphinxes guarding entrances that lead to nothing but grass and scattered stones. Hattusa in its prime, around 1400 BCE, was one of the great powers of the ancient Near East. The Hittites corresponded with Egyptian pharaohs as equals. They had their own cuneiform script, adapted from Mesopotamian writing. They built temples and palaces and administrative buildings. They controlled trade routes and military fortifications. And then, around 1200 BCE, the same mysterious collapse that affected Mycenae struck Hattusa. The city burned. People fled or were killed or dispersed. The empire vanished. For thousands of years, the name Hittite was known only from biblical references, and scholars weren't even sure if they'd really existed or were mythological. It wasn't until the late 19th century that excavations at Hattusa revealed the truth. Here was a great civilization, completely forgotten. Its archives of clay tablets still in the ruins, waiting to tell their story. When you walk through Hattusa today, you feel the enormity of forgetting. This wasn't a minor city. This was an imperial capital, and yet it disappeared so thoroughly from human memory that it became a legend, then less than a legend, just stones on a hillside that shepherds ignored. The silence here is profound. The site is vast, so even when other visitors are present, you can easily find yourself alone among the ruins. Standing by the Lion Gate, where carved stone lions have guarded the entrance for over 3,000 years, still fierce, still watching, though they haven't seen a living Hittite pass through in millennia. Or think of Timgad, a Roman colonial city in what is now Algeria, built by Emperor Trajan around 100 CE as a military colony for veteran soldiers. Timgad was designed on a perfect grid, a showcase of Roman urban planning. Straight streets crossing at right angles. A forum, temples, a library, a theatre that seated thousands, public baths with intricate mosaics, triumphal arches marking important intersections. For several centuries, Timgad thrived. A desert city, yes, but supplied with water through Roman engineering. A cultured place where Latin was spoken, where people attended plays and bathed in the afternoons and argued about philosophy in the forum. Then the Western Roman Empire fell. Trade routes collapsed. The water systems broke down and weren't repaired. The population dwindled. By the 5th century CE, Timgad was largely abandoned. Desert sands crept over the streets, buildings filled with wind-blown dust. The careful grid of streets disappeared under dunes. For over 1,000 years, Timgad was buried, not destroyed violently, just quietly covered, preserved under sand like a photograph in an album. When French archaeologists began excavating in the late 19th century, they found a nearly complete Roman city, frozen in time. Streets still paved, column bases still in place, mosaics still colourful under their protective layer of sand. Today, you can walk those streets again. You can stand in the theatre and imagine it full of spectators. You can trace the route water once took through the city. You can read Latin inscriptions on monuments, messages from people who assumed their city would last as long as Rome itself. The silence in Timgad is different from other ruins. There's something eerie about how complete it is, how empty, as if everyone stepped out for a moment and never came back, as if the city is waiting for residents who will never return. Then there's Mohenjo-Daro in modern Pakistan, part of the Indus Valley civilization, one of the world's earliest urban cultures, contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but far less known. Mohenjo-Daro, around 2500 BCE, was a planned city with advanced features. Straight streets laid out on a grid, houses built of standardized fired bricks, a sophisticated drainage system with covered sewers running beneath the streets, public baths, granaries, multi-story buildings, evidence of writing, though the Indus script remains undeciphered, so we still can't read what they wrote. The people of Mohenjo-Daro lived orderly lives. We can tell from the archaeological evidence. They had standardized weights and measures for trade. They produced pottery and seals with distinctive animal motifs. They imported materials from distant regions, suggesting extensive trade networks. And then, around 1900 BCE, the civilization declined. We're not sure why. Climate change? River shifts? Disease? Invasion? The evidence is unclear. What we do know is that Mohenjo-Daro was gradually abandoned. The sophisticated urban culture faded. The Indus script was forgotten. The cities were left empty. For millennia, Mohenjo-Daro sat untouched. A mound in the Indus floodplain, sometimes flooded, slowly eroding. Local people knew there were old bricks there and sometimes took them for construction. But the scale and sophistication of what lay beneath wasn't understood until excavations began in the 1920s. Now we can walk through Mohenjo-Daro and see this ancient city. The Great Bath, a large public bathing area that might have had ritual significance. The granary, where surplus food was stored. Residential areas where families lived in brick houses with their own private wells and bathrooms. It's remarkably modern in some ways, the urban planning, the sanitation systems, the standardization. And yet, it's utterly ancient, utterly silent. Streets where children once played are empty. Houses where families gathered are roofless shells. The writing on seals remains mysterious, refusing to give up its secrets. When you stand in Mohenjo-Daro at sunset, as the light turns golden and the shadows lengthen, you feel the weight of unknowing. This was a great civilization. Thousands of people lived here, worked here, raised children here. They had language and culture and art and trade, but we can't read their words. We don't know what they called themselves, or what gods they worshipped, or what stories they told. The silence here is total in a way that even Mycenae or Uruk aren't silent. Because in Mycenae we have linear B tablets we can read, myths that were written down later. In Uruk we have cuneiform we can translate. But Mohenjo-Daro keeps its secrets. It shows us its bones, but not its voice. Or consider Palenque, deep in the jungles of southern Mexico, a Maya city that flourished between 400 and 800 CE. Palenque was a regional power, ruled by dynasties whose names we know from hieroglyphic inscriptions. Kings like Kinich Janab Pakal, who ruled for over 60 years and was buried in an elaborate tomb beneath the Temple of Inscriptions. The Maya of Palenque built temples on stepped pyramids. They carved intricate reliefs showing kings and gods and cosmic events. They developed a sophisticated calendar and writing system. They studied astronomy, tracked planets and stars, predicted eclipses. They played a ritual ball game in a special court. They burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. And like other Maya cities, Palenque eventually declined. The classic Maya collapse, around 900 CE, saw cities abandoned throughout the region. Drought, warfare, political instability, some combination of factors led to population dispersal. The cities weren't destroyed violently for the most part. They were just left empty as people moved away, seeking better conditions elsewhere. In Palenque's case, the jungle reclaimed quickly. Vines grew over temples. Trees took root in plazas. Moss covered carved stones. Within a few generations, the great temples were barely visible, swallowed by vegetation. For centuries, Palenque slept under green shadows. Local people knew ruins were there, but the scale wasn't apparent until Spanish colonial reports in the 18th century sparked archaeological interest. When you visit Palenque today, even after decades of excavation and clearing, the jungle presses close. You can see how quickly nature takes over, how patient and relentless. Stand in the palace complex, in the tower that might have been used for astronomical observations. Listen to the jungle sounds, howler monkeys calling, birds singing, insects humming. The Maya are gone, but the forest remains. The trees that watch the city rise now watch over its ruins. The silence here is different too. Not empty silence, but full silence. The quiet of waiting life. The jungle breathing around the stones, slowly, inexorably reclaiming what the Maya briefly cleared. All these cities, Hattusa, Timgad, Mohenjo-Daro, Palenque, they add to our understanding. They show us different ways cities can fade. Some burn and collapse. Some are buried by sand. Some are swallowed by jungle. Some simply empty out as people walk away. But the result is always the same. Silence. Stones. Memory fading into myth, fading into forgetting. And yet, in their silence, these cities speak. They tell us about impermanence, yes, but also about resilience. Because even after millennia of abandonment, something remains. The stones remember. The artifacts hold meaning. We can piece together stories, partial and incomplete, but real. We can know that people lived here, loved here, created here. That knowledge is a kind of immortality, even if it's not the kind the builders imagined. All these cities and thousands of others scattered across every continent share this quality of peaceful absence. They're not violent ruins. Most weren't destroyed in spectacular catastrophes. They just stopped. People left, gradually or suddenly, and nature began the slow work of reclaiming. Vines growing over walls, dust accumulating in courtyards, birds nesting in empty rooms, trees taking root in cracks, slowly prying apart masonry that once seemed permanent. There's something deeply calming about this process. Maybe it's because it reminds us that nothing lasts forever, and that's okay. These cities had their time. They were full of life, full of noise and smell and activity, and all the messy vibrancy of human existence. And then their time ended, and they became something else. Memory, ruins, tourist sites, archaeological puzzles, but also peaceful places. Places where you can walk and hear mostly wind. Places where the urgent demands of ancient life have faded into the patient stillness of stone. When we visit these lost cities, physically or in imagination, we're doing something our ancestors couldn't. We're seeing beyond the rise and fall. We know how the story ends. We know that Mycenae burned, that Petra faded, that Uruk was abandoned. We can stand in the ruins and feel the full weight of impermanence. And paradoxically, there's comfort in that. Because if these mighty cities, these centers of power and culture and commerce, if they could rise and fall and yet still leave something beautiful behind, then maybe our own efforts aren't futile either. Maybe the point isn't to last forever. Maybe the point is simply to be fully present while we're here, to do our work, to love the people around us, to create what we can, knowing it's all temporary. The potter in Mycenae didn't need his vessels to survive 3,000 years. He just needed them to hold water for this season. The merchant in Petra didn't need frankincense trade to continue forever. He just needed it to support his family for his lifetime. The scribe in Uruk didn't know his tablets would be studied by scholars millennia later. He was just doing his job, recording today's transactions. And yet, here we are, remembering them, not as individuals, we don't know their names, but as types, as human beings engaged in the universal human activities that transcend time and place. Working, trading, creating, worshipping, raising children, sharing meals, telling stories, sleeping under the same stars we sleep under now. If you're using this to fall asleep, I hope it's working. I hope your breathing has slowed. I hope your mind has released its grip on the day's concerns. Because that's what these lost cities offer us in the end. Permission to let go. They're proof that civilizations rise and fall, that everything passes, that the urgent dramas of any given moment eventually fade into peaceful silence. And in that silence, there's rest. So let yourself rest now. Imagine yourself walking through one of these cities at dusk. Maybe Mycenae, the golden hour light warming those massive stones. Maybe Petra, the rose-red cliffs glowing as the sun sets. Maybe Uruk, standing by the river as evening falls and the first stars appear. You're alone, or nearly so. The tourist crowds have gone. You have these ancient streets to yourself. Your footsteps echo softly. A bird calls from somewhere in the ruins. The wind moves through empty windows, and you can feel it, the presence of all those accumulated days, all those ordinary Tuesdays stretching back through centuries. The potter, the merchant, the scribe, the child carrying water, the family sharing a meal. They lived, they laughed, they worried, they loved, they died, and now they're at rest, finally, after millennia of patient silence. You can rest too. The day's work is done. The hunt can wait until morning. The urgent email can wait. The project deadline can wait. For now, this moment, you can be like these cities in their current form. Quiet. Still. At peace. The stones will still be here tomorrow. The ruins will still tell their stories. The wind will still blow through empty rooms. And you'll still be here, breathing, living your own ordinary days that will someday be ancient history too. But tonight, you can sleep. Under the same moon that rose over Mycenae and Petra and Uruk. Under the same stars. Part of the same long human story that began when the first cities rose from plains and deserts and rocky hills, and continues now in this moment, with you, drifting toward rest, letting the peaceful silence of lost cities carry you gently into sleep.